The partnerships were dissolving in silence. Retail corridors once prepared for medical dominance were being dismantled. Internal emails shifted tone from expansion logistics to legal containment. Board members stopped asking about scale. They asked about exposure. The technology did not scale. It barely functioned. Yet capital had already been committed. Reputations had already been attached. Political endorsements had already been secured. Inside headquarters, engineers had been raising quiet flags for months. Accuracy deviations. Device inconsistencies. Validation gaps. They were overruled. The narrative held. Until external scrutiny forced internal panic. This was not a sudden failure. It was a controlled illusion reaching structural limits. A demonstration had persuaded some of the most powerful investors in the country. The question is not how the collapse happened. The question is who authorized belief over verification. At its peak, the company occupied a psychological fortress. Healthcare disruption narrative. Silicon Valley mythos. Youthful founder archetype. Scarcity positioning. The promise was strategic elegance. Hundreds of blood tests from a finger prick. The board composition amplified legitimacy. Former cabinet officials. Military leadership. Diplomatic stature. Authority created insulation. This was the command illusion, when symbolic power replaces operational scrutiny. Internal testing environments did not match public claims. Engineers understood this asymmetry. Leadership did as well. But incentives were no longer aligned with correction. Valuation growth required belief continuity. Silence became rational. Every funding round strengthened the illusion of validation. Media coverage reinforced inevitability. The fortress was not technological. It was reputational. And reputational fortresses collapse differently. They fracture from inside before the public sees cracks. The pivotal move was not launching the product. It was staging the demonstration. The 2014 retail validation environment presented controlled conditions. Selected machines. Curated workflows. Peripheral equipment operating offstage. The demo created a victory announcement before verification maturity. Investors interpreted operational readiness. Retail partners interpreted scalable reliability. Internal scientists understood the gap. This was internal intelligence suppression. Raising concerns carried career cost. Dissent signaled disloyalty. Compliance ensured proximity to power. Leadership framed doubt as resistance to vision. The decision was simple. Protect the narrative. Or expose fragility. Narrative preservation won. The demo did not prove capability. It proved persuasion strength. And persuasion strength can temporarily overpower empirical weakness, especially when authority bias is present. The illusion scaled faster than the technology. That asymmetry is where collapse incubates. Signals began resisting containment. Journalistic inquiry. Laboratory inconsistencies. Whistleblower discomfort. But internally, escalation logic had already engaged. Admitting limitation would trigger valuation contraction. Contract withdrawals. Political embarrassment. So exposure risk was reframed as hostility. This is the fortress illusion in defensive mode. Legal intimidation replaced technical correction. Messaging discipline replaced transparent validation. Employees were compartmentalized. Fear culture stabilized short-term narrative continuity. Authority manipulation sustained investor patience. But strategic asymmetry widened. The more expansion occurred, the more fragile the core became. Every new partnership increased blast radius. The company was no longer managing innovation risk. It was managing truth containment. That is a different battlefield. And containment battles rarely remain internal. External scrutiny did not arrive as outrage. It arrived as documentation. Investigative reporting began tracing validation gaps. Laboratory standards. Device inconsistency. Regulatory exposure. The inquiry led by John Carreiro introduced discipline pressure. Inside, leadership interpreted this not as correction but as attack. This is incentive-driven blindness. Admitting technical weakness would collapse valuation. Maintaining denial preserved executive position temporarily. Engineers who pushed for transparency were isolated. Legal structures tightened. Information was compartmentalized. The command structure shifted from innovation defense to narrative containment. Retail partners, including Walgreens, expanded exposure before independent verification stabilized. That expansion multiplied systemic risk. The counterforce was not a competitor. It was reality reasserting standards. And reality scales faster than secrecy Once documentation exists, the illusion began losing altitude. Quietly. When collapse probability increases, leadership behavior changes. Meetings become smaller. Messaging becomes stricter. Loyalty becomes a screening mechanism. This phase marked command isolation. Data flow narrowed upward. Executives filtered information before it reached the top. Contradictory evidence was labeled sabotage. Fear culture matured. Employees calculated personal risk before speaking. Career preservation replaced scientific integrity. Silence became rational. Board members, insulated by prestige, relied on executive summaries rather than technical audits. Authority bias replaced verification. This is how powerful systems delay self-correction. Not through ignorance, through selective acknowledgement. Internally, the gap between public claims and operational capability was no longer ambiguous. It was measurable. But measurable truth is threatening when capital structure depends on narrative stability. So, escalation continued. Not because leadership believed the technology worked, but because admitting otherwise would collapse the entire command hierarchy. Regulatory scrutiny formalized the threat. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services identified severe laboratory deficiencies. Operational bans followed. Certification risk escalated. The illusion encountered statutory force. This was the moment narrative control lost jurisdiction. Retail partnerships froze. Confidence retracted. Valuation compression accelerated. Internally, leadership posture shifted from expansion to defense strategy. Legal preparation replaced product iteration. This marks the transition from innovation collapse to truth suppression collapse. The system no longer attempts to improve the technology. It attempts to survive exposure. The chain reaction became visible. Demonstration, expansion, documentation, regulatory enforcement, capital withdrawal. None of this was chaotic. Each link followed logically from the prior distortion. The collapse was not triggered by journalists. It was triggered by the earlier decision to prioritize belief over validation. Exposure was merely timing. Once authority confidence breaks, power redistributes rapidly. Investors recalculated risk. Political allies distanced quietly. Board reputations recalibrated. The founder's narrative of inevitability no longer protected the structure. This is the silent escalation completing its arc. For years, fragility compounded beneath surface legitimacy. When rupture came, it appeared sudden. It was not sudden. It was delayed visibility. Employees faced investigation exposure. Retail partners absorbed reputational cost. Patients confronted uncertainty. The blast radius extended beyond equity holders. Truth suppression collapses carry external damage because decisions propagate outward before verification stabilizes. The company had engineered expansion before empirical maturity. That ordering is the indictment. The collapse was not technological failure alone. It was incentive architecture failure. And incentive architecture failures migrate. They do not disappear. Collapse moved from market consequence to judicial scrutiny. Federal prosecutors reframed the narrative from innovation failure to intentional deception. The defendant was no longer a visionary founder. She was a decision-maker whose claims carried financial consequence. The courtroom became the final battlefield. The case, United States versus Elizabeth Holmes, narrowed the focus to representations made to investors. Not technological ambition. Not disruption rhetoric. Statements. Assurances. Demonstrations. This phase exposed authority manipulation. When symbolic credibility substitutes for verifiable data, persuasion becomes an asset class. Board prestige had insulated inquiry. Investor proximity to power had suppressed doubt. In court, prestige holds no evidentiary weight. Documentation does. The trial did not create the collapse. It formalized it. The decision on trial was not optimism. It was knowingly sustaining belief after internal awareness of fragility. That distinction defines fraud-based collapse. Fraud does not scale through charisma alone. It scales through aligned incentives. Early employees gained equity exposure. Investors gained proximity to a cultural icon. Board members gained relevance in a new technological frontier. No actor benefited from slowing the narrative. This is incentive corruption drift. Each stakeholder rationalized partial ambiguity because full transparency carried personal cost. Internal awareness existed long before public exposure. Engineers understood testing limitations. Laboratory personnel saw performance gaps. Leadership saw investor appetite. But career risk and capital dependency created a silence equilibrium. Truth became economically inconvenient. In such systems, moral compromise is rarely dramatic. It is incremental. Each unchallenged claim reduces resistance to the next. Eventually, the gap between internal knowledge and external messaging becomes structural. At that point, reversal requires personal sacrifice. Few volunteer for that. The architecture protects itself until external force intervenes. This structure is not unique. Consider Enron. Complex financial engineering masked internal instability until accounting transparency forced exposure. Consider WeWork. Narrative valuation outran operational fundamentals before capital markets recalibrated belief. In each case, the blind spot formed during success. The command illusion replaced scrutiny. The silent escalation compounded beneath prestige. The difference is surface domain, energy, real estate, biotechnology. The pattern migrates across industries. What links them is not sector volatility. It is leadership choosing narrative continuity over structural correction. That decision feels rational in the moment. Preserve confidence. Protect valuation. Avoid reputational shock. But delayed correction amplifies exposure. Fraud-based collapses differ from strategic miscalculations. They require internal awareness of distortion. And that awareness existed inside the system long before exposure. The pattern is portable. Truth suppression collapse does not disappear after conviction. It relocates. High-growth sectors with opaque metrics. Founder-dominant governance. Investor enthusiasm concentrated around identity. When verification mechanisms lag narrative velocity, distortion risk rises. The migration pattern follows three signals. Unquestioned authority concentration. Incentive alignment around valuation speed. Cultural framing of doubt as disloyalty. When those signals align, early warnings are discounted. This is not about one executive. It is about structural immunity to dissent. In fast-scaling environments, ambition often outruns institutional guardrails. The question is not whether another deception will occur. It is where, and whether internal intelligence will be suppressed again for short-term stability. Patterns migrate because incentives migrate, and incentives rarely reform voluntarily. Collapse remains predictable when structure remains unchanged. When the structure collapsed, power did not vanish. It redistributed. Retail partners retreated into stricter compliance protocols. Venture capital recalibrated due diligence optics. Regulators expanded laboratory oversight authority. The vacuum reorganized the terrain. Former executives faced legal exposure. The founders' sentencing formalized personal consequence. Yet institutional capital did not disappear. It migrated to new narratives. This is the overlooked phase of collapse. Punishment individualizes blame. Systems quietly adjust thresholds. Board governance norms tightened in rhetoric. Verification language strengthened in investor decks. Audit signaling increased. But signaling is not structural immunity. Power moved from charismatic founder dominance toward compliance-centered gatekeeping. However, gatekeepers also operate under incentives, speed, access, competitive positioning. Aftermath reform often hardens procedures without reforming incentive architecture. That leaves latent vulnerability. The public interprets sentencing as closure. Institutions interpret it as recalibration. Those are not the same outcome. Truth suppression collapse leaves residue. Investors become selectively skeptical. Employees in adjacent startups calculate whistleblower risk differently. Patients and customers recalibrate trust in emerging medical claims. Reputational contagion spreads quietly. The biotechnology sector absorbed secondary scrutiny. Regulatory friction increased for legitimate innovators. Capital allocation slowed in specific diagnostic segments. This is the invisible cost. Fraud compresses future trust bandwidth. Capital becomes more cautious, but not necessarily wiser. Some high-growth founders internalized a different lesson. Control narrative more tightly. Avoid documentation trails. Limit internal dissent visibility. That is strategic adaptation in the wrong direction. Fear culture, once exposed, does not disappear from the ecosystem. It evolves. The long-tail damage is cultural. When ambitious founders observe collapse, they choose between transparency discipline and more sophisticated concealment. Incentives decide which path dominates. History suggests incentives often win. Consider how narrative dominance preceded exposure in cases beyond biotechnology. At FTX, rapid valuation expansion outpaced internal controls. Governance concentration replaced transparency. Incentive loops rewarded growth optics over structural audit. Different sector. Same architecture. Authority concentration. Cultural framing of dissent as betrayal. Investor enthusiasm, overriding verification. Truth suppression collapse adapts to technological fashion. It appeared in energy accounting at Enron. It appeared in flexible workspace valuation at WeWork. It appeared in cryptocurrency infrastructure. The surface narrative changes: decentralization, disruption, democratization. The internal mechanism does not. Belief scales faster than verification. When governance relies on charisma and proximity rather than audit depth, structural exposure compounds silently. The industry label is irrelevant. The decision architecture is identical, and identical architectures produce predictable outcomes. The collapse is complete. The sentence is delivered. The company dissolved. But the pattern remains active. High-growth environments continue rewarding velocity. Boards continue deferring to visionary dominance when returns appear imminent. Employees continue weighing career risk against ethical escalation. The next iteration will not look identical. It will appear more sophisticated, better legally insulated, more careful in documentation, more advanced in narrative control. Truth suppression collapse evolves under pressure. The central question is not whether another founder will misrepresent capability. It is whether incentive systems will again suppress internal intelligence long enough for exposure to scale. The blind spot forms during success. The command illusion grows with prestige. The silent escalation compounds beneath expansion. And by the time collapse becomes visible, correction options are minimal. The verdict is rendered. The migration continues.